Okay, well, we've had a bunch of breakups in between different times, and I was gone. I started this book of Hosea, and then I was gone during spring break, and then I had a lesson, and then we had a singing, and so it just really fragmented to me when I tried to put all this together. So, and plus, then of course, having some problems technically with our projector, but that's okay. We're going to be heavily looking at the verses anyway as we go through it. So as we put again the context of Hosea, we're around 760. Years are weird sometimes. We know that we can look at when that they were taken away into captivity. It was around 722, 21. The prophets, Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, and many of them that were prophesying were in this time frame about 40 to 50 years before, around that window. So we can kind of get a gap of when. So specifically, Hosea's is a long time of prophecy that he prophesied through over 50-something years. Primarily, he was prophesying to Israel themselves, but there's a point where he does seem to go back and go to Israel and to Judah. So we have a divided kingdom. The northern kingdom is called Israel, the southern Judah. And the northern kingdom, when it divided, remember, it went into basically Baalism and divided and started looking at golden calves, ritualistic again, starting to mimic a lot of the gods around them. God started punishing them. Just because he divided them, we need to remember, he did not divide them so that they spiritually would change and become different. They were still in a covenant relationship, and God was going to bless them. That's important. We're going to talk about that because God has never given up on his side of the faithfulness that he has said he would have when he made these covenant relationships with Abraham all the way through. And all the descendants in the 12 tribes are going to receive this faithfulness that God is going to keep giving. Sometimes it's hard for us to see that. So when God put this tearing apart of the kingdom from Solomon because of Solomon's life, again, he still intended them that it was to remain a theocracy controlled by God, controlled and led by following the Mosaic law, and all the worship was to only be in one place in Jerusalem. And that place then, because of Jeroboam the first, his jealousies or whatever, decided, no, I don't want my people traveling south. It's kind of like saying, well, if we got open borders and they all go down there and they say, hey, that Jerusalem's a wonderful place, let's just go move down there and buy some land. And then they would migrate down and he'd lose his influence, which is ridiculous because the people were on the land that they had inherited. For them, it wasn't like putting your property up for sale and go down and buy some land down in Judah. No, you can't, because the land in Judah belongs to the tribe of Judah. But anyway, so as they divided up and they started their own journey, every one of those kings were evil. And toward the end, Jeroboam the second is really the last significant king of any worth as far as when it comes to what he accomplished for the northern kingdom. And he's one of the very first ones mentioned. At the beginning of the book, we looked at how that right away, in just the naming of his children, that the symbolism was there. The very first child was named Jezreel. Now, Jezreel was in reference to the cleaning of the house of Ahab and the overkill that Jehu, who was one that God had given the mission to wipe out the house of Ahab and bring his judgment on him. Ahab had already died, but his son was ruling. Jezebel was still alive, but he went overboard. He went excessive, and he ended up killing the king of Judah and the king of Judah's sons. So it's interesting that we're looking at maybe 3 or 4 generations, so about 40 years later, that now when Hosea is prophesying, the first child is named Jezreel. That's the valley of where Jehu came in, and basically it was a bloodbath on the house of Ahab and just went overboard. So remember that name, because it's fascinating what you're going to see God does with these names. The second one was the idea the child was no mercy. So you have a child that is a judgment. The second child was no mercy. The third child he has is not my people. So you're not my people. I'm not going to have mercy on you, and there's a judgment coming. All three of those, again, those names are going to come back around. And the way God reworks things and does that, even the name Jezreel itself that we see. Now, God had instructed him to go and to marry a harlot, a prostitute. And that to us is something very shocking. And it's a real hard, this is probably one of the hardest things that I've seen a prophet go through, is to have that object lesson of going out and marrying a woman and getting in a committed relationship with her. And then you know that she's going to be unfaithful, that she's going to go after all the men. And that is devastating. That's the emotion, hold on to. That's what God wants you to understand, what it's like for him. For the way that God feels is just like you, if your spouse was to be unfaithful and go out like that. And so this is a marriage. This is a marriage of, as some have said, it sounds very rough, of whoredom, a marriage of whoredom, of something that is an abomination, but we understand the importance of that. So the symbolism is strong. God's judgment is strong. And when we look at the overall book, it has always a judgment and redemption. Judgment and redemption. In the very first part of the book, chapters 1 through chapter 3, is a judgment and hope. And that's the thing that we always need to remember. This is, I just get so upset when I hear this about people. And if you've heard me recently, I get off on this little bit of a tangent about how people tried to say that the God of the Old Testament was a bloody God and that he's not the same God. And somehow the New Testament God is like a big love fest, oh, Jesus is love, and forgiveness, and just accept him in your heart and everything's wonderful. And it's not the same God. Wrong. It's the same God. And how you can see that he wasn't just about being a God of destruction and blood is in this book itself, in Hosea. He's talking about how his heart is broke because of the unfaithfulness of a wife who has dedicated and said she was committed to him and went off into whoredom. It was devastating for her, and she didn't see it and didn't understand that everything that she thought that her lovers were giving her were not giving it to her. It was a lie. And so this unfolding hope and judgment, and then the judgment as it comes out really through the middle part of the book from 4 to chapters 9. And then the last of it from 9 to 14 is hope. This is why when you say, well, God was just a God of terror and blood and judgment in the Old Testament, there's so much hope in this book, but there's also so much that we can look at and see what a broken heart. So let's pick up in chapter 2, in verse 1. And as he closed out chapter 1, he had talked about the idea of the children again and ended with the children. But he ended there talking with some hope. And one of the things that gets kind of weird is this idea of Israel, because he says, I have no mercy, but I'm going to have mercy on Israel and about the restoration. So it's like he's saying, I'm going to punish them, but yet they're going to be restored. And there's a lot that we looked at 2 weeks ago about the idea that this all happened. A lot of times people, we understand the tribe of Israel never came back in its entirety and occupied its land again. Never comes back. And yet we look at the prophets, and the prophets talk about how that all of Israel will be restored, and they will all receive this blessing and continued blessing. But then you go, well, wait a minute. You listen to Hosea and you listen to all these prophets, and it talks about how this punishment and that they're going to be removed off the land, and then we know they never come back. You're going to see this again as well when we look here. The idea that not all of them, just because those who are occupying that territory, when the Assyrians came in and removed them and mingled them throughout the world, doesn't mean that there wasn't a remnant that was a part of the tribe of Judah. If you go back and you read the history, when they divided and Jeroboam I started setting up these golden calves in worship, you know who left? The priests. Remember, the priests, they did not inherit land. They were set out around all the tribes, and their job was to represent God and to uphold the law. So the Levites leave, and we can read in the Kings and the Chronicles where they started leaving, and there were people even from Israel willing to give up their inheritance and come south. And they started living among the tribe of Judah. So then after Assyria comes in and takes Israel physically off, there's still representation of the other tribes in the territory of Judah. We forget, we kind of miss that aspect. That's very important to understanding that the prophets aren't lying when he talks about that how Israel is going to be blessed. And at the same time, he's saying, I'm going to wipe them out. Because you're looking at the idea that the blessing that from Abraham to all of the tribes was going to be fulfilled in the returning of all the captives coming from Babylon. When they go off and Judah's taken, those who migrated south from all those tribes are going to go with them into captivity and come back and represent the totality of all of them and receive this blessing. So that's a part I want you to kind of keep in mind when you hear the prophet, especially like here. So as we read through there. And so the ending of that is this idea of this greatness. Now, I want you to look at verse 11, and he says here, and the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head. That is the reuniting of them coming back when they come to, they come back from captivity. When King Cyrus declares it, when Nehemiah, Ezra, and them come back and start building the temple. They come back under the king Zerubbabel, and he was appointed as the governor, and there's the representation of Israel. So that's that part I'm talking about. And also what he says, and they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Whoa, wait, what is that? Now, if you remember the name Jezreel, what I just said, Jezreel was a valley where it was an abomination because the house of Ahab and what he did. What you're seeing here is a rejuvenation, taking a name of judgment and such horrible thing that occurred, and he's turning them around. You're going to see it even with the names of the children. And that is such a deep thought because he's taking all these no mercy, and we're going to see it in the very next verse. You're not my people. And you're going to see how God is taking and he's given this hope that even a place that is going to become that judgment, Jezreel, that when this reuniting comes back, Jezreel will become a doorway. And he's going to mention it again in the second chapter. And so the sad part is he talks in this, starts verse 1, and this gets a little bit confusing, but he says, say to your brothers, you are my people, and to your sisters, you have received mercy. Now, forget the idea that chapter 2 and chapter 1 are divided. And that's the problem with division sometimes. So we just talked about how they're going to come back. They're going to be united as one head, and they're going to come up from the land. They're going to be great in the day of Jezreel. And then he has these conversations to the brothers saying, you are now my people. That's the name, the same name in the Hebrew there as the opposite of not my people. Now it's a play. It's like, now you are my people. And to your sisters, you have received mercy. Remember, the other one was, you will have no mercy, was the other child. He took that and he's saying, you're going to go from no mercy, not my people, of judgment. And he's taken all three of those and beautifully said, now Jezreel will be a glorious door. And he says, and now my people you will be my people, and I will give you mercy. And this is going to be at the restoration and the rebuilding of the second temple. But now there's this conversation. He says, plead with your mother. Plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her whoring from her face and the adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and I make her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and make her like a parched land, and kill her with thirst. Now, this, you got to be Hebrew to understand it. If you were Hebrew and you understood your history, kind of like American history, well, we used to know our history pretty well. If we had certain references, you could almost say, oh, that's like our forefathers, our founding fathers, George Washington and things, like the apple tree that was cut down and the leader who never told a lie. You know who I'm talking about, don't you? You can go there historically. Honest who? Abe, right? I mean, we know because we're Americans. This is what's so amazing. We miss it. So what do you have? You have a mother. The mother is the house of Israel. But now there's a layer to this because we have to also consider there's also Israel. It's kind of neat because Israel is also a name used for all of God's people chosen of Judah, all the tribes combined. Remember, Jacob was renamed Israel. It's also the idea of the northern kingdom, Israel. But it's also a voice. And so the mother here is the kingdom of Israel in the north. But who are her children? This is a conversation he's saying to the children, talk to your mother. So now he's talking to the average person to say, go plead with your mother. Now, if we read earlier, we heard that God said, well, she's going to be punished. We're going to be wiped out. So it's coming. So it's kind of like, well, why is he now having the kids go and beg mom? Because mom's already been judged. And guess who gets it too? The children, right? Mom suffers, the parents suffer. Guess who else suffers? The children. So the mother representing the level of the nation state, and then the children being all the people, because there's a remnant among all nations. That's the one thing that sometimes we forget. Just because Israel was so evil, it didn't mean that everyone was. And even after Hosea and some of these prophets, there was a second migration. It's very fascinating that there were even more that moved because they listened and they saw this. And it's like he's saying, you need to wake up your mom and tell her, you need to change your life. You got to stop this. Now, when he says in verse 3, he says, lest I strip her naked and make her as in the day she is born. When was Israel born? See, we think a natural birth, a mother being born natural. When was Israel born? And that's where it gets a little interesting. But if you look at the context, it's really kind of pointing to the time that they come out of the wilderness and he established them at Mount Sinai, that they were born a theocracy and they became a nation, and that's when they were born. And so they had been blessed and had all this history, and he's saying he'll strip you back and take you back to the basic. You notice he doesn't say, I'm going to take it away from you and destroy it. But what he's saying, I'm going to hit a hard reset on you and put you back. And that's what he did. Just what I described, just what he said in the last verses of chapter 1. He said, I'm going to send them off. They're going to come back united. That was a hard reset, wasn't it? And bringing them back again. And so that's what he's describing here. And it all is around the wilderness. Look what he says. And make her like a wilderness. Make her a wilderness. What did they do for 40 years? They wandered. It was in a wilderness. A parched land, he describes. Thirst. Remember the bickering over water? And that. These are all those little references that as a Hebrew would be reading it going, oh, wow, this sounds just like the way we came out. We came a nation and we went through the wilderness, and that was terrible. And how we almost died of thirst, all the things that we went through. And so that's what he's saying there. But upon the children, verse 4, I will also have no mercy because they are children of whoredom. The product of what she's doing, there's many of those children. Now, you remember up at the top, he says, kids, talk to your mom. But there's still some of the children and some of the produce of what she has done that they're just like her. And so they're also going to be caught up in this type. Because when he's talking about whoredom, we're talking about the idolatry, the spiritual idolatry that they were doing, and which is basically an unfaithfulness. Her lovers were all the false gods she was worshiping and following afterward. And so that's why he says their mother played the whore. She conceived them and acts shamefully. Or she said, I'll go after my lovers and they will give me bread and my water, my wool, my flax, my oil, my drink. Therefore, I will hedge her up. Now stop there. So she thinks that she can leave her husband, God, go to these other lovers, false gods, and they're going to provide for her. Now, we know they're dead, right? They can't do anything. So where are these false gods getting their stuff? From the husband. That's the irony. Is that this very one who is seeking after other lovers and worshiping them and thinking that those idols are giving them the wool, the flax, and all this? No, they're getting it from the husband, and she doesn't see it. Isn't that a lesson for us as well? When you think about that. And isn't this a great picture how brokenhearted it would be for God, for as a husband to have a wife that he's given her all these blessings and she thinks that I can go off to other lovers, other gods and worship them and they're going to give me. And yet he's sitting there going, but it's coming from me. And you're glorifying these fake gods. And so because of that, verse 6, therefore I will hedge her up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her so that she cannot find her path. Again, you notice he didn't say, I'm going to kill her. What's he going to do? He's going to block her in, and he's going to block her down to where she can't have that access. And then, so that she can't find the path, she shall pursue her lovers, but she can't overtake them. And she'll seek them, but she can't find them. Why? Because God's going to block them. Now, this is also a little bit also pointing to this concept that is fascinating as well. Even Judah had a problem with worshiping idols, but historians and scholars they'll point out very boldly how the fact that when they come back from captivity, idol worship is not a problem ever again. There is not an idol worship problem. No matter what God did before they went to Babylon, and they would repent, and Manasseh would try to restore stuff. They go right back to Baal. They go right back to Baal. They go right back to the Ashtoreth. They go back to those fake gods. But when they come back from captivity, it's gone. This is a part of this where God says, I'm going to lock them in. I'm going to block them out from this. Even she's going to try, but she's not going to be able to. And what's that going to force her to say? In the second part of 7, then she will say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me than now. And she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal, which I just learned that's the proper pronunciation, by the way. Baal. I can't get used to saying it that way, but Baal. I like to say Baal but in other words, they took the very things that they thought their false gods were giving, and then they worship their God with that. And how much would that break your heart? You mean you're lavishing upon your spouse all the things and beauty and all, you're not holding anything back, and they turn right around and they use it for whoredom with other gods. Therefore, because of this, because she had this ignorance and she didn't have this knowledge of that all was coming from me, I will take back my grain in its time and my wine in its season, and I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. Now I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. And I will put an end to her mirth, her feast, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed feasts. And I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which she said, these are my wages, which my lovers have given me. I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall devour them. And I will punish her for the feast days of Baals, and when she burnt offerings to them, and adorned herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after lovers, and forgot me, declares the Lord. So there's still a judgment, isn't there? There's still a consequence that has to experience. But you notice, even though the unfaithfulness of this wife of his, God, us, Israel, God is going to do everything he can in his judgment, in his righteousness, to still wake us up and give us an opportunity to be restored. And that is, I think, where I want to stop, because I want us to keep this lesson in mind about this, because the next section of this verse is going to be how God now is going to shift and give mercy to Israel. But it's so rich when we look at this book of Hosea that I've really enjoyed. I hope you'll go ahead and read. And again, just jump back and read it again. Read chapter 1, 2, and go all the way into 3. And next week we'll grab, and 3 is a very short chapter, so I'm going to bring these two together, the last part of 2. If you're here this evening and there's something that we can do to help you in your relationship with God, if it's to establish it and become a Christian, if it's the prayers of the church, we're going to have this song while we're singing it. If you're comfortable and you'd like to, let it be known that we can help you. Come forward while we stand and we sing.